Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Yeshiva League Pass Faceoff. I'm your host, Josh Caston. We're sponsored by the Weiselberg Law Firm. For 16 years, you've entrusted Elliot with the growth and guidance of your kids, and now it's time to let him do the same for your family's most important asset, your home. Admitted in both New York and New Jersey, Elliot can help guide you through any residential or commercial purchase, sale, refinance, or lease with championship quality and award-winning care. If you're looking for your commercial coach or a new home is your goal, reach out to the Weiselberg Real Estate Services today at 917-952-2597, or you can email them at wiselawsk@gmail.com, reminding everybody once again, that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely. Back in action for what on paper is really our 8th episode, and it's our final episode of the season, our season finale, and for that, we bring back Elliot, who has been with us for so many different occasions this season, but it's really fitting that he joins us for the season finale yet again, as he did last year as well. So, Elliot, welcome again, and let's close it out on a high note.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good opportunity to recap what we just saw with this past school year.
Alrighty. The difference in this year versus last year is that this year we have a JV league to talk about. We sort of limited it a little bit last year and sort of spoke about some of the upcoming sophomores who we knew would be moving up to the varsity level following, their JV season. But we're going to stay away from that for now. Elliot, let's get right to it. The JV season, we'll start with them. A lot less competitive, I would say, as a whole. At least the amount of teams that really were given a shot, was a lot less than that of varsity. I think that really helps limit it and allows us to focus, more on those teams. Why don't we, no offense, and it's not slight to any of the teams that really, didn't come close. Well, why don't we get right to the thick of, who obviously was left just a little bit short. We all know the big elephant in the room was TABC ran away with the league this year, pretty much having by far and large the strongest squad on paper and really the most experience, considering that most of their team was freshmen last year and they almost won the championship last year. So that I guess we'll start with DRS as the runner-ups. We spoke about it we spoke about it during the preview championship episode where, there was a clear advantage that we thought one team had over the other, that being in TABC. Where do we believe it sort of fell short for DRS?
Just thinking back to it, I mean, I don't know if we could really say fell short for DRS considering the way that game went. I think that had we gotten a little bit further in and actually, I mean, look, during our preview, we said that in order for DRS to keep it close, they have to do X, Y, Z. Well, you can't get any closer than a 1-1 game going into overtime. So I don't really think that this is a sense where you could say that DRS fell short. They did most of what they had to do. I think a lot of the shortcoming may have actually been more on the TABC end, not really taking advantage of many opportunities, as we said during the broadcast. I think DRS actually made the most of the opportunities they were given, just not being able to cash in beyond that one goal that they scored, early on in the second period. I think that was just the fact that they couldn't add to it really is what brought the championship game to a halt for them when TABC was able to tie it up and not being able to get another one on the board was the downfall. But I can't say that DRS really fell short considering what the expectation was for them coming in.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I will change my my viewing of that, or the way I said that. You're definitely right. DRS was clearly the underdog going into that game, despite the fact that they were stronger than every other team that would have gone up against TABC had it not been them. And, I think you're definitely right. They did use some of those points to their advantage, that being that, Frisch is a gym that's much more similar to the one DRS has than the one TABC has. That being in the sense that, TABC might have had the bodies in terms of the numbers, but DRS was able to take advantage of that in ways still, you saw that with the amount of space, at least in the gym, guys like Itzy Uden were able to use their size. Ellis Bornstein was able to sneak through cracks here and there. Jack Greenbaum was able to sneak through cracks here and there. Micha Khan was able to sort of, do his Kel McCarr impression and go end to end with the ball. And I mean, the kid ranked 2 or 3 posts in the game. 1 or 2 came within the last 5 minutes of regulation. But as you mentioned, that all of those things that DRS used to their advantage, while TABC, we mentioned, doesn't have the greatest track record, at least the players that were on this JV roster don't have the greatest track record for playing well in Frisch. Their winning percentage, I mean, they've won 3 out of 4 games played there. It's really not that, it's not like it was really a disadvantage to them as much as, we probably would make it sound like. I do want to give credit to the DRS coaching staff, though. Not that I want to take away from TABC. They went into a gym they're physically, experienced in, but haven't played well, track record wise. But, on DRS's side, I mean, Larry drew up a great game plan. I thought that, he prepared his team well. It was just the fact of the matter that TABC was just that much more talented overall than DRS was this year.
Well, the difference, one of the differences between the two, and I'm going to tie actually both ends of it together on DRS taking advantage and TABC not taking advantage, actually, came down to something like that, where DRS took a page from what they saw the year before, in that Larry Gross was able to double shift Nathaniel Lawrence for much of the game on defense for DRS 2 years ago when they won the championship, and it to great result. And so coming into this game, Larry's game plan was to try to do the same with Yitzi Uden. And because of the opportunities that TABC afforded them, Yitzi was able to be on the floor for, I would say, roughly 24, 25 minutes of the game. And despite the fact that he didn't score, he was a presence and somebody that defense had to account for over the course of those minutes, which equate to a vast, significant portion of the game. And in terms of the other end, one would have imagined that TABC, as we said leading into that game, TABC would have taken a look at last year's game and said, we have the distinct size advantage this time in a gym like this. Why don't we use it to our advantage? And it just seemed like there was a lot of going away from that whole power and using the size and the advantage, really, even leading into their power play, which we mentioned on the broadcast, where the first power play was, for all intents and purposes, it was an abject failure. And it wasn't until they started putting a body, this time the body, in the middle, that they were able to get the result they wanted in terms of tying up that game. I think that I don't want to say it's a failure, but given what that team should have been able to do strategically, a 2-1 result, even in a championship, we saw what they did only a few weeks earlier, a January 1st meeting where it was a 4-1 thrashing of DRS. There really isn't any reason why, with the talent that they had, that game shouldn't have been the same. I think they allowed DRS to stick around, and DRS took advantage of the opportunity to stick around and almost walked away with a championship.
Yeah. There were definitely glimpses, I would say, where TABC looked like they were, the TABC Storm that everyone saw during the regular season. But you're definitely right. They did to some extent allow DRS to sort of stick around. And again, I mean, like I said, Larry coached a brilliant game. The whole DRS coach, not just Larry, obviously you had Giller and Savitsky in the moment there. But he coached a great game for them. Sometimes it's just really, I mean, like sometimes it's just a bounce. And, we've said that time in and time out. And I know I also just said that it was TBC, just being the more talented team, but taking into account everything that could have happened that didn't. Part of it was because DRS, played the way they played and sort of lined their shifts up and had their style, executed the way they wanted to do it. So, definitely a vast improvement for what it was on New Year's Day as the result. However, still not the result that DRS was looking for. And it's tough. But
well, somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose. You only get one champion every year.
Yeah, look, they were clearly the 1 and 2 in the entire league by the end of the year. And, as close, and we'll get to this, we'll mention SAR very quickly and shortly. But as close as SAR came to beating TABC during the regular season and also had them on the ropes at times the same way DRS did in the championship, DRS just with that championship experience of those 9th graders from last year who were 10th graders this year that played impact roles was really, I think, the difference. And, for me is what gave them the nod over SAR and a team that had a chance of taking TABC down.
So I think SAR, and that's something we'll see next year. SAR really was a team a year away from their stardom. I think that they were just too young for the moment, despite the fact that they were talented enough. I think that when push came to shove, it just came down to experience and maturity, which is something that they'll get over the summer. And next year, they'll probably be pending decisions happening in other schools, which we may or may not touch on in this broadcast. They'll probably be the clear-cut favorite starting off next year. And that mainly has to do with the fact that talent that almost got them to a championship, mostly on the backs of 9th graders, is going to be 10th graders next year who will have matured in a league where the majority of the talent is leading up to varsity.
Yeah, and I mean, now that we've sort of started to touch on SAR, I mean, I want to go a little bit more in depth on that. I mean, you mentioned majority freshmen made up this past year SAR JV team. And, I'm looking at this and I'm not saying, there were a couple of good freshmen that were just that good that carried the load. No, there were a lot of good freshmen on this team. I dare say that you could compare this type of turnout for how well their freshman class played. They were so good that this is the 3rd time within the last 7 or 8 years we've seen them have a very successful season thanks to a load of freshmen, obviously with a couple impact sophomores here and there. But if you want to go back most recently, 3-4 years ago during the 2019-20 season, that got cut short, you had a load of freshmen like Eitan Kraus, Judah Hain, Ari Fenster, Jed Konovich, Elon Lurie, all of those guys. And there are more names I've left off that list because there are too many.
All the guys that were on that team this year. That's that senior team.
They just won the championship as seniors. When they were all freshmen, they were on their way to a championship. That just never got played. So they were crown co-champions with TABC that year. But even before that, if you want to go back a couple more years, another 3-4 years beyond that point, 2014-15, the SAR Sting bring in this loaded class that included guys like Jason Burian, Shua Friedman, Gordy Kolb, the biggest name of that entire league, let alone JV, let alone just JV, like maybe even varsity. The guy was the most impactful player out of both leagues, considering he played 3 years on varsity. But regardless of that, obviously, if you want to go back on those two names, the first team we mentioned that had the freshmen of Kraus, Fenster, Hain, all of those guys had some impact seniors. They had Solly Tuckman, they had Sam Froman, obviously. Those were 2 of their big name players. And then the team that was even farther back, before that, 2014-15, still had guys like Joey McGillner and Ellie Gelfand, Simon Freilich. Not a lot, but enough to complement the talented younger players they had. In one case, it led to a championship win. In one case, it led to them getting there and not getting to play it. And this year, they were just less than 5 minutes away from getting there before DRS got a lot of momentum and ultimately used it to catapult them into the championship. And I think that next year you make a very valid point, and it goes without saying that we have to mention like the names on this roster. Some of them got awards in our awards show that Avidan and I did earlier in the year, not too long ago, but names like Jack Linhart, Nate Zitter, Mo Jeter, Michael Goldman, just to name a couple. Ellie Fenster, who won, one of the awards, as well as sort of a guy who's been slept on. It really shows. And who knows what's happening with their freshman class next year? For all we know, we could see players coming in from other middle schools, elementary schools. We don't know where those decisions were made to go, but at the end of the day, I mean, maybe some of the guys in, their JV or even varsity teams have siblings that will be coming in that play impact roles next year, depending on, where they decide to go for school. So it's going to be very interesting, but I would definitely say that if they're not the clear-cut favorite, they have to be up there as one of them. I think that pretty much sums it up for JV for really all of the top end talent. So I guess at this point, I mean, unless you think there's really anything or anyone else we should mention to move on to varsity at this point.
I think outside of those three teams, there really wasn't a sense that anybody else was going to get close to the finals. I think you even take a look at the result that North Shore sort of had in their game against TABC in the semis as the four team of that three, and you sort of see just how far the gap was between 3 and 4. TABC with an 8-1 drubbing over North Shore in the semifinals, whereas the other game, the DRS SAR game, which was clearly going to be the better of the two games, SAR 2-1 lead till late in the third, and then a 4-2 loss. But I think it's clear that beyond those three, really not close in terms of anybody else throughout the league, unfortunately.
Yeah. And, as we mentioned, it's not a slight towards other teams. There were some very good talent amongst the rest of the teams that were, close to the top, but not at the top with those three teams that we've mentioned. So that basically sums it up for our JV league this past year. So let's move on to varsity. This is what everyone wants to hear about. The league that, with all due respect, the JV league was way more competitive, had way more question marks, and in many ways was way less predictable. So with that being said, we all know the big, the elephant in the room, as we just mentioned, SAR just won the championship this year. At the start of the year, a lot of people probably didn't think that based on the way they started. I think they started with like a 1-2-1 record or a 1-3-2 record, something like that. Ended up winning 9 games during the regular season, which was obviously, not something you would have expected based on the names and the talent that team had. But in the end, I mean, championship is a championship one way or another. So they got that done. Similar to the way we started talking about the runner-up in JV, let's go ahead and do that for varsity. So Frisch had not only lost the championship, but lost it after having a 3-0 lead within the first half of the first period in the championship. I asked the question where it went wrong for DRS, and you made the points that maybe it didn't really go wrong. Something clearly went wrong for Frisch. What happened there?
Speculation is sort of a risky move when you're not in the huddle and when you're not on the bench. But we know that Frisch was a little bit hampered by injury going into that game. And so their second line was not as potent as they would have liked it to be. It was very much the second line they went with was very much a third line quality where it's a lot of grinded out fast control. But beyond the first line, it really didn't seem as if they were going to get scoring contributions. So when that first line was off, it was really sort of a defensive shell style game where it was very much a grind game. And that left them a little vulnerable once SAR started clicking, because if that first line wasn't on the floor, it didn't seem like they were going to score. And unfortunately, there were a couple of points where it seemed like that first line sort of took the foot off the gas a little bit. Not that they could, not intentional, but when you're on the floor for as long as they were, especially in a gym like DRS, sometimes no matter what your level of physical ability is, you're going to get tired. And when you're facing a top level competitor like SAR was, clearly this is a championship game. And with a team that's as good as SAR, you give them an inch, they're going to take a mile, and they did. And the truth is, the first 5 minutes was a credit to the Frisch scoring power, and the next 40 was very much a credit to Jed Konovich and what he was actually able to do. Because outside of those 5 minutes, Jed Konovich was the MVP of that championship game.
Yeah,
you can't discount those first 5 minutes, but outside of those 5 minutes, he was locked down and made several extremely impactful saves that kept SAR in it. I mean, there were a couple of goals that almost took them out of it, but towards the middle to late stages of the third period, when you needed him to step up, he really, really did.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned those first 5 minutes where, you can't discount it, and yeah, he was a little shaky, giving up 3 quick early goals. Avidan and I were also, like you and David Cole were sitting right behind that net where Andrew Strolowitz was, and obviously all the action was on the other side, but you guys were calling the game. Meanwhile, Avidan and I were sitting next to each other, not too far away from you guys, still behind him. And as soon as, Frisch, they got that second goal, and then shortly after they got that third goal, the first one came 35 seconds in. So it took a couple minutes before they got their second and third. Avidan looked at me and said, "Josh, this could get ugly. It's getting ugly now, and it could get ugly, like even more and even faster." And I was like, it seems to be that way now, but we still got 30 minutes left. That's a lot of time. And I hate to say this. This is going to sound exactly like the opposite of the result most people would probably think of when they hear what I'm about to say. But Jakey Fight and Ethan Alter were definitely the 2 best forwards on the floor for Frisch through the first, really all night, obviously. All night. And I dare say that maybe even all game, they still individually were the 2 best forwards on the court. However, and this is a big however, you mentioned them being together really was their downfall after they scored those 3 goals. I was talking to a couple of other coaches around the league after the game, and I said, we were talking about the matchups and the way Jaak Lisker decided to deploy his lines the rest of the way. And after looking at it and seeing that they went with a pretty much, the same 3-man rotation they had gone with all year, and Tal Glassman, Charlie Hilbert, and Eitan Geisler, that, as dominant as Alter and Fight are together, you have a 3-0 lead. Now, I'm not telling you don't try to score goals, but Alter and Fight individually are good enough to carry a line on their own. And when you have them out there at the same time, you're doubling down. And sure, you might get a goal. The odds are more likely. You're also wearing them down faster, despite the fact that they both had they were both very well conditioned to play that game. Don't get me wrong, but you're saving gas in the tank by splitting them up, and they're still good enough to carry lines on their own. I mean, Ethan Alter was probably the most dominant forward in the league. We saw what he did for Team USA, for God's sake. And completely irrelevant. But Jakey Fight also, Alter brings the speed and the skill, and then Fight will bring the size and the skill. So, pick your poison. Which one do you want to go after if you have to go after them individually? It's giving you 2 more problems to worry about rather than the other way around. And, we mentioned it during the broadcast and also after the game and on the awards when we gave Jacob Schwartzman the coach of the year in varsity, not in varsity, in JV, like also talking about what he did in varsity briefly, that you mentioned on the broadcast, yeah, Jaak Lisker's an experienced coach. He knows what it takes. He knows why he's won and he knows why he's lost and he knows what he has to do in order to get back to the top of the league. But with that being said, while Schwartzman is the, so to speak, inexperienced coach here, he's also a wild card. Jaak has no idea what he's throwing at him. He has no idea what his tactics are, and he has absolutely no idea how he's going to go about coaching this championship game in a situation where SAR is now, one of, if not the hottest teams in the entire league going into that point. So I think it definitely shows, both sides of the story, but you're definitely right. I think that, Frisch's biggest downfall was that they kept trying to, light up the scoreboard, and it worked for 5 minutes, but, it clearly dropped off after. I don't think they scored a goal until like midway to late through the third period.
Early on in the third.
Earlier on in the third. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, look, spade a spade. If you're looking at a team like SAR, you have to think about all the possibilities of what they can do. You know the team that they have. I mean, especially us who have watched them for 3-4 years. You know what they can throw at you. And we got on Jacob on the broadcast for doing it too long, but I mean, look, it worked out for SAR in rolling 3 lines because they were able to get mismatches and eventually put their top line many times with the second line of Frisch, and sometimes even force the first line of Frisch to have to double shift, and that really wore them down and forced them into penalties, which got power play goals, which were extremely important. And I think you have to. It takes you back to, if you're up 3-0, the biggest challenge that you have is yourself and trying to stick to your game plan. The biggest challenge when you are down 3-0 is trying to figure out what about your game plan isn't working. And there was a timeout at 3-0 where it really could have gone differently for both teams. And it shifted because you had Stefan Neowitz's goal almost immediately after. You go into the second period and you get 2 really. I mean, I don't think you could have timed it any better than they did with those 2 goals right there. One on the power play. I mean, it was Rudman just took him on his back in the second period, got that game level, and away you went. And I think that the trade-off going back, trading off goals in the third and the sequences in the overtime. And again, although we sort of killed Jacob for rolling 3 lines in the overtime, I think we have to at least acknowledge how well Charlie Reich and was able to fill in, and Gabe Perler was able to fill in and to really play well. But that could have gone another way also. And the fact that it was Hornblass, the first liner, putting the game away, I think that was always going to be the case, that it was going to be a first liner. Going too far away from it from either side probably wasn't the best bet, but just being fresher on the SAR side was what made the difference that deep.
So we've already touched on the top 2 teams that finished, respectively 1 and 2 in SAR and Frisch. Let's, I mentioned obviously we didn't go this far or as far into JV, but we can go a little bit deeper into varsity because it was a little bit more competitive. The next 2 teams that were sitting just short of the championship were DRS and TABC, but in reverse order in terms of who was closer in terms of the seeding on the regular season. Let's start with DRS because they had it a little bit rougher a ride getting up to that point. I mean, we spoke about it during our predictions episode for the playoffs. That was when I did that with Avdan, and especially in the championship preview episode when all 3 of us were together. DRS had a very strong regular season, but one of their downfalls during the regular season was a very, very tough loss to Frisch, and it ended up being the downfall and the knife in their heart through ending their season ultimately, where they got that same Frisch team and basically the same result. Frisch running circles around them in their own gym, let alone in front of that massive crowd twice during the regular season. And that's just the way it goes sometimes. I mean, I think similar to the way that, you mentioned TABC being that much better and that much more talented than DRS and JV, despite the fact that it was a close game score-wise, was very much the same narrative here in the sense that Frisch was just that much more talented. Ethan Alter and Jakey Fight were the most unstoppable line in the league this year. You could have put anyone in. I mean, even though they lost the championship game, they scored all 4 goals for them. It just goes to show they're capable of lighting any team up on the scoreboard. And I don't think that DRS had the ability really to stop them out of nowhere.
I think that for DRS this year, it was a case of being probably the 4th best team out of the top 4 that had a chance to make and win the championship. And I think there was a little bit of distance beyond TABC, Frisch, and SAR for DRS. And while being an extremely good team and finishing at the top of the East, I think that after TABC, Frisch, and SAR, you would probably say that there was a little bit of a step down to DRS. And I think DRS finished exactly where they were going to. I don't know that they were going to be able to take any of TABC, Frisch, or SAR in their own gym. I think that how they finished was exactly how they were supposed to. I don't think that was the semifinal result that we all looked at and said, how did that happen?
Yeah. And again, I mean, like, if you're asking me, my perspective on DRS this season was obviously they had a lot of good pieces. Nothing, as special as Frisch, TABC, or SAR, as you've mentioned. But we knew one thing for sure. That was, they were going to be well coached. They were going to have some of the more, dominant players in the league, although not as dominant as the ones we saw at the very, very top. You look at Mark Matlis, Moshe Grossman, Moshe Ratner, and even on the back end, some guys like Noah Friedman. They really were a very overall solid team. I mean, they won double-digit games during the regular season and a playoff game, but when push came to shove, they just weren't going to have the ability to take out, a juggernaut really in Frisch, TBC, or SAR. And for me, the way I look at it is it was more of an experience year for any of the juniors, even though they have a championship under their belt as sophomores. Obviously, you look at Nathaniel Lawrence, you look at Shmuel Fine, Jake Frankel, Daniel Austin, who started pulling the reins down the stretch. For me, that kind of showed, Larry obviously wanted to win, but it also showed, in my opinion, let's start also like thinking about the fact that we're defending a title next year. With that exact class, just mirroring it, a grade higher for everyone. So definitely an interesting way to go. Did I think they were going to beat Frisch, SAR, TABC? No, I'm going to be straight up honest with that. I didn't think they would. I didn't think it was the most impossible thing in the world, considering that they had played close with both of them for about a period and a half, and Frisch and TABC at least, before really falling apart. And then against SAR, I mean, they beat SAR during the regular season. Now that I know was earlier on when SAR hadn't really hit their stride yet, still showed they were capable of pulling it off though. So for me, it wasn't really, a shocker that they lost in the semis. However, just because, it's DRS, their narrative is always, the expectancy to be a top contender year in and year out. Don't get me wrong, they made the semis. They were a game away from going to the championship. It showed they were clearly a class below, the top 3 teams in the league. And other than that, I think, it's going to be interesting to see next year what happens because there, as I mentioned, there were some juniors on that team that played significant roles.
I think you're 100% correct. I think that that junior class next year being senior class and being the lead dogs for varsity, you roll back to last year where in JV it was a two-horse race. I don't know whether or not whether or not we're in for that again. I think that there are a couple of teams that certainly have improved, and a couple of teams that certainly can make it a bit of a dogfight. But I mean, we'll take. I guess we'll take it at the beginning of the year, and we'll see what happens with them because they were the odds on. I mean, I shouldn't say the odds on. They are the odds on favorite now to go back to the championship at the very least. And you have to think that TABC likely is the odds on favorite on the other end to go back to the championship. So it's going to be a question of who else has improved to really challenge the norm of what's gone to this point with those two.
All right, so that pretty much sums it up for the thoughts and the overall outcome on DRS this year, and a little bit on what we sort of can expect for next year. Whether or not it's going to happen, only one way to find out. We got to get there though. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about TABC. They were the other semifinal team that failed to make it to the championship, and one that, despite the fact, I know we talked about how well SAR was playing down the stretch and how well Frisch was playing down the stretch, but I mean, TABC was a team that we predicted to get to the finals really on a consistent basis through multiple times, saying it throughout the regular season. And I mean, even prior to the season, we did the season preview last year and saying, I mean, there was a chance that this TABC team could be the quote unquote perfect team, so to speak, with the very not deep necessarily, but very talented class of juniors from this past year, meshing with a very deep and talented class of seniors this year that had talent at every single position. So, I mean, this is also, it's not like I want to say, where did things go wrong? Because they were, it wasn't exactly I don't want to say it was necessarily like, like a coaching aspect or a motivational aspect for TBC, but something did not, just like from the start, something seemed off about the whole situation. They didn't seem like themselves. And ultimately, I mean, it led to them losing out on an opportunity to go back to the championship. So where do we believe things sort of fell off the cliff for TABC?
I think it really was just the calendar flip. I think once they went from the regular season to the postseason, it was a different animal. I think you look at that Kushner game, and you and I spoke privately a couple of weeks before that, and we were talking about how a shame it would be if Kushner missed the postseason because if you extended it to 10 teams and Kushner was team number 8, 9, or 10, theoretically you could see the 9 or 10 team beating the 7 or 8 and then having an opportunity the way they played this year to go out and beat the 1. I think that Kushner game showed that there was a lot left that TABC needed to step up within the 2 weeks between that game and the SAR game, and it sort of didn't happen. They got jumped on extremely quickly, and despite cutting back into it in the third period against SAR, TABC was never really in that game, and in all honesty, probably not even really in the playoffs. I think their season sort of came to an end in their mind against Kushner on Sunday the 5th, and it wasn't really a great showing on the 14th. And I think there was some great aspects of Kushner's game that night, and I think Ethan Hirschnoff played well above his station in keeping Kushner level, really, and almost pulling it out, except for the last 20 seconds of that game. But I think that that was a game that TABC was extremely lucky. And I think Mo Fuchs will say the same thing because he has. They were extremely lucky to actually walk out of that game still in the playoffs.
Yeah. And I mean, I said it before, and I'll say it again. I was actually talking to a couple of Kushner alumni who saw that game from Israel and from college who weren't there to physically experience it in person at TABC. But I mean, I said it before, I'll say it again. I know I'm repeating that, but it could have been any other team than TABC that night, just simply for the fact that the saving grace for TABC in that game was Chaim Mermelstein having an outstanding game. Any other team, and it's not a slight towards any other goalie, it's just Chaim was clearly number one, and it wasn't close with anyone else. Like, could have been any other team, and Kushner would have been on their way to the semis. And not only would they have been on their way to the semis, didn't matter that they were the 8th seed, they would have still been the away team no matter who they played. It could have been DRS, SAR, Frisch, Hank, anyone, YDE, didn't matter. They were going to have a lot more favor than not, because if they would have gotten to that point, they would have knocked off the one in the entire league. And to lose a 1-goal game the way they played in TABC, and for Hirschnoff to have had an outstanding performance, for Isaac Mendelson and Freddie Dresner to control the game for Kushner, and Jordan Service, that he was the best player. Other than Chaim Mermelstein and Ethan Hirschnoff, he was the best. Forget about those two even. He was the best field player on the floor for both teams combined. It wasn't close. It really wasn't close. He was outstanding. He had shots. He had so many shots on goal, created offensive opportunities, lockdown defense on that deadly Adler Brandwein line, and even the Fields and Krause line. And again, while yes, it was TABC walking out with the win, TABC just, you're right, something about them did not seem like themselves in the playoffs. Really, let alone the last, like regular season game or so. They, you mentioned, they thought it sort of came to an end after Kushner, and it seemed like they could have had the mentality, we don't care who we're going to play, we think we're there. It's kind of like, I'm not saying this to throw suspicions on anyone here, but it's sort of like the same thought process and narrative. I'm thinking about the way that JV TABC team coached their team in the championship last year, where they said, we beat DRS already, like we kind of know what we're getting from them. I think we're just going to beat them because we've done it already and we know we're capable of it, rather than trying to solidify the reasons for what we did that made us successful and how we can replicate that again and get the same result again. Because they didn't do that. DRS ended up winning the championship. And I think it's sort of the same thing here with TABC. I'm not taking anything away from Mo Fuchs. I'm not taking anything away from like that JV example. Again, I'm not taking away anything from that JV coaching staff of TABC that had Svika, Josh, and Yosef Robin. But at the same time, something had to have changed in the tactics there, because TABC, for as dominant as they were and as dominant as they looked during the regular season, looked nowhere near as dominant or like themselves, even in a shade of what they were during the playoffs.
Again, it's not. Again, I mean, from my end, especially as having been a coach and still a coach in some capacity, I'm not gonna go as far to cast aspersions on what's going on in the practices and the huddles. So I'm not going to.
It's not intended to come that.
No, I agree with. I know what you're saying, but I think we have to acknowledge the fact that sometimes what's drawn up on paper also just isn't what goes on in a game. And I think the TABC Kushner first round game was a great example of that, because I mean, you have two teams there, and both of them are fighting for the same goal. And they both have to have different strategies as to how to get there. And sometimes you're caught off guard, no matter who you are. And no matter what your team is, and sometimes the better team loses. I think that the point that we're both trying to get across really just is that it didn't seem like that light switch went on for the TABC team once the playoffs started, and they were lucky to get past an 8 seed, but the way they played was certainly not good enough to get past the 5 seed, which easily could have been the 1 seed had it not been for a very rocky start to the year.
Yeah. So we've hit on the top 4 teams and even a little bit past that. Again, I mentioned, JV was not as competitive a league as varsity, so I mentioned we were going to dive a little bit deeper. Let's continue to go in that direction. Not much deeper, though. We're going to sort of open it up to a couple of teams that still made the playoffs, but didn't quite get as far, even as the semis. And the reason I want to mention that is because it's actually somewhat ironic. The teams that we just saw get much better and get closer to the top of the league, like we mentioned, Frisch replicating an appearance in the championship, and SCR going one step farther and not just getting to the championship, but winning it this year. We're going to see, it's actually ironic. We're going to see those 2 teams specifically take a little bit of a step back, I believe, roster, or at least strength of roster wise next year than they had these last 2 or 3 years. And in terms of what else, the teams that weren't necessarily all the way at the top of the league, like the teams in DRS and TABC, even Kushner, you want to talk about, we touched on them a little bit for that first round matchup against TABC. And a team we haven't touched on at all in Hafter, who lost to DRS in the first round. We're going to see all 4 of those teams next year take a big step forward, or at least predictable, predictability wise, we're going to see them take a step forward, because that's the way the outcome happened 2 years ago when the teams that'll be next year's varsity teams were mirrored to be JV teams. All 4 of those teams were the teams that made the semifinals. You had DRS taking on Kushner, and you had Hafter taking on TABC. So, where do we sort of throw it into, not where do we sort of throw it, but let's throw it in that direction. Where do we sort of see the buildup for these teams? What they get out of this year, and how do we think that can be used, or how do we think they can go about, using that as fuel or motivation for next year? Because if you're asking me, I think that, it's still pretty clear. DRS and TABC, it happens to be, they were the 2 teams in the semifinals this year that didn't get to the championship. They're supposed to be on paper the 2 best teams in the league next year, or the 2 favorites, because they were the 2 teams in the championship on the JV level 2 years ago. But now you're going to talk about, the building up and the growth of these other 2 teams in Hafter and Kushner, for example. And I guess we'll sort of anchor it towards them a little more, because we've already touched on TABC and DRS, in saying, they got to the playoffs, but as talented as they were, do we necessarily know they would have gone past anyone other than the teams we played? And I know what I said for Kushner. It could have been any other team other than TABC in that first round, the way they played, and they could have moved on. Yes, that's 100% true, and that's legit. Hafter, on the other hand, never really had a chance against DRS. I was talking about in the pregame, in the preview episode of the varsity playoffs with Avidan, and my question was, is this going to be a game where Hafter's younger players, because they were a younger team this year, let's acknowledge that. And Kushner also had a couple of guys that were on the younger side. They moved guys up like James Orbach, Kobe Weiselberg, and I'm thinking, though, like more on the Hafter side, was this going to be a game where those guys stepped up and got some really, even better experience than what they just got during the regular season? Or was it going to be Max Newmark being pelted with shots left and right until he eventually cracked and it snowballed? And unfortunately for Hafter, it happened to be the second thing. However, there's a lot to look forward to for that team next year, and also for Kushner next year.
So I think the difference lies in the makeup of the 2 teams. I think for Hafter, there is more to look forward to than for Kushner. So we'll start with them. If you look at Hafter's roster from last year, there were only maybe, I want to say, 3 or 4 12th graders on that squad. And with the exception of Corey Spitzer and maybe Gabe Glatt, we're not really looking at players that that Hafter is going to have to stretch to replace. The majority of that roster, the ones that contributed, are still there. That's still the same squad that made it to the made it to the playoffs, I should say. Despite the fact that their schedule was inordinately tougher than most anybody else in the East, and I would say one of the toughest in the league. They're returning their contributors. You look over at Kushner, and while they're certainly returning two extremely talented underclassmen in James Orbach and Kobe Eisenberg, and you're going to get contribute. You have Jacob Schnipper and Sammy Steiner, who are going to be 12th graders. You lost the main powerhouses of that squad. You lost the Isaac Mendelsons. You lost the Zieg Rabinowitzes. You lost the Jordan Services. They'll and probably, and this is, I guess, a little bit of insider information, just given what I've been able to hear, but they'll probably get back the services of Simon Rosenfeld next year in net, having taken a year away to play basketball. But they're not going to be an extremely deep team next year. They are very much dependent on the same four guys that we just mentioned, and they're good contributors. But is that going to be enough to really do what they need to do in a division that's going to have a lot of competent teams? You're going to have an SAR team that's going to be better than it was as a JV team 2 years ago. You're going to still have that TABC team. Whether or not that Frisch team takes a step up is a question as well. But you're going to see a much more competitive West. And if you only have 4 or 5 players that are going to be contributors, you have to question just how well you're really going to be able to do in a division that has teams that are going to be able to go 2-3 lines deep.
Yeah, and I mean, now that you mentioned, the fact that we're talking about some teams that might have even made the playoffs, but not necessarily been serious contenders, or not even serious, but even just contenders enough. I don't know that I would even call Kushner a serious contender, despite the fact that they qualified for the semifinals 2 years ago on the JV level. I'm looking at a very similar situation in the East. Well, Hafter, we mentioned, is definitely the better team between those two, at the very least on paper. I'm looking at the high-end talent of that Kushner team, and I'm saying there's a way that some of it could be better than Hafter's, but it's just not deep enough. And you're absolutely right about that. However, I'm also looking at some of these other teams in the East that we sort of have unknowns for also. You mentioned SAR, Frisch. You didn't mention MTA, but they could be an unknown factor next year in the varsity league on the West side as well. With a new coaching staff, obviously, they'll have Rabbi Stone, who's tend to be a little bit more successful on a varsity level than they've been switching up coaches in JV. I think that's been a part of it, even though they just had a very successful season. So maybe we could see something very positive come out there. But on the East side, we're looking at a Magen David team we didn't see 2 years ago. We're looking at a Flatbush team we didn't see 2 years ago, both of which have very solid talent. We're looking at a Hank team that is going to have one of the best players in the entire league, Elliot, who we are quite familiar with up until this point, who's been playing varsity the last 2 years as a freshman and a sophomore. He's now going to get that opportunity to play against kids who are more in his age class, and who knows what he's capable of doing. I mean, if he's already capable of scoring 25, 30 goals against kids 2-3 years older than him, the competition, it's not a slight. It's gotten a little bit weaker as opposed to what it's been the last 2 years on the varsity level. And who knows, he might score over 40 goals this year on varsity based on the drop that we're going to see and the competition he might face, because Hank is going to have a very interesting situation next year. And also, if you even want to take it a little bit past that team, I mean, it's going to be interesting. North Shore is going to be tough to beat in their home gym. Rambam is going to be a team that's not very deep either, but also has some top-end talent they could play with. New coaching staff there. So it's going to be a very interesting situation, I think. I'm not saying Hafter should be concerned, but they definitely have to keep their eyes peeled, because of how many unknowns there are, similar in the way, you mentioned Kushner. They have top contributors. James Orbach and Kobe Eisenberg were fantastic this past year on the varsity level as sophomores. And even if you want to bring back, the other 2 or 3 names that were on that varsity team as juniors this past year, Sammy Steiner, Jacob Schnipper, I think you missed Sean Felderman, but also a piece who's going to be a vital piece of that Kushner team next year on the varsity level, and was this past year. They have a very solid core. The question is, how far is it going to take them with their depth? And
I'm sure we'll touch on that when we get to next year. I mean, if we're looking ahead to next year already, especially with when it comes to the East, when you look at HAFTR, I think you have to look at HAFTR right now as probably the second best team in the East, just given who they have. Talking about Hank this past year, with Elliot Yisraki, it wasn't only the Elliot Yisraki show. I mean, Elliot Yisraki benefited from having a line mate in Jordan Getcherman, who extremely talented player and able to take a little bit away a little bit of the attention away from Elliot for him to do what he did. Yeah, Joey Diamond in net for most of the year, save for the handful of games where he didn't play because of a concussion. But I think we got a glimpse of what life is going to look a little bit like for that Hank team moving forward. And you mentioned Elliot Yisraki potentially scoring 40 goals, which would be a Yeshiva League record. They're going he next year. He's going to need it. I mean, because there is much less in the way of scoring than has been on that squad for a number of years as a result of that senior class leaving.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I mean, we won't dive too deep into it, but also talking about the way teams can play in their own gym. Obviously, I mean, it's been very much the same for a lot of these narratives. But Flatbush plays in a rink. That's a tough sort of home court advantage to be able to combat, similar to the way SAR and Kushner both do on the west side. North Shore has the biggest gym, surface play wise. We've touched on that. A lot of teams, while they won't have a lot of high end talent next year, and really won't have that much, really shouldn't have much other really than Elijah Kuehl to have to really worry about. It's not a slight towards this team. They know that they're supposed to be a drop as opposed to what their JV team did this past year. Well, it's going to be interesting to see what they do, in their home gym, because they know that gym better than anyone. It's, I think it's going to be pretty, predictable what they do on the road, at least having to go up against talent like that. And also, I mean, also to close it out with Rabat on the east side. I mean, they're a team that very much mirrors Kushner, in my opinion. Not very deep. They have talent, but is it going to be able to take them? But we're not really here to talk about that at this point anymore. It was really just the recap of this past season, which ultimately I think we ended up covering for the most part. And I mean, it's going to be interesting. I think we're looking at something that we haven't really had the opportunity to do yet, because 2 years ago we didn't know much about about what the JV league would be. This coming year, we're going to know, how to sort of predict most of the varsity league, with the exception of a couple of those unknowns, as we've mentioned.
I mean, you mentioned 3 teams that 2 years ago weren't playing in the JV league. You mentioned Hank, you mentioned Flatbush, you mentioned Magen David. 2 years ago, none of those teams had a JV team. So how they're going to react to that extra year of varsity, despite the fact that a team like Flatbush ended up having a JV team this year where those kids went back down to JV. But still, any experience is good experience. And the question's going to become ultimately, has everybody improved to a point where the gap has narrowed, or has the playing on the varsity level, like what HAFTR did last year, playing on the varsity level like what Hank did last year, does it give them a decided advantage despite the fact that they didn't play on the JV level 2 years ago? HAFTR did play on the JV level. I meant this past year. Will it give them that advantage? I think if you look at the way things went this year, you had Hafter playing two extremely competitive games with Hank. You had Hafter beating Hank. You had Hafter and Magen David, and you had Magen David and Flatbush playing some fantastic games. And you had YDE. We didn't mention YDE. YDE finishing second in the East, finishing fourth overall. YDE was a team that was able to show weaknesses in other teams as well. So the question is going to be, while 2 years ago can be indicative of what's to come, when you don't have that showing, when you don't have that on paper, because we certainly didn't have the YDEs in the league 2 years ago, but they're wild cards, and all of these teams are going to be wild cards, having not been around at that point. And so it really, again, this is more for a preview for us next year. But if what happened this year is any indication of it, we're looking at a squad, a Flatbush squad next year that's going to be young, but is going to have scoring talent. They're going to have a very good goalie. You're going to have a Magen David squad that this past year had a lot of young end talent, a lot of 10th and 11th grade talent that's going to be back next year, and is going to be a force in the league, having one of the best players in the league in Harry Towell. This past year, he was, I refed several Brooklyn games and several Magen David games, and he was a dominant force whenever he was on that floor. And it's going to be very interesting to see, while, again, this isn't the purpose of this show, it's going to be interesting to see how the extra year of not being at that level is going to skew the standings next year. It certainly had an impact this past year, and I think that's the point I'm sort of trying to drive, is that not having anything to base it on from 2 years ago in varsity made this year in varsity a massive wild card also, despite the fact that we had a sense of who was going to be there towards the end. But the teams that were there along with them, I think we may have had a little bit of a surprise, at least as far as it came to what we would have predicted beginning of the year. And I think that's really what we're going to take moving forward to next year.
Yeah. Well, we're not here to talk about that anymore. We're going to close it out right here. There's only one way to find out what will take place, and that's to actually experience it next year. So for now, we're going to close it out. But before we do that, I just want to thank you, Elliot, for coming on again multiple times this year. I want to thank everyone who was able to make an appearance and, for making it possible coming to Yeshiva League Pass Faceoff for our first full season, but our second official season, I guess. And want to thank all of the viewers for tuning into this episode of Yeshiva League Pass Faceoff, our season finale. And once again, to the Weiselberg Law Firm for sponsoring, reminding everyone once again that is the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely.